Chapter 21, Save, Save, Save. Following the victory, Ulrichsen gave the boys 2 weeks off. When they returned to the shell house on May 4th, they rowed raggedly for the first few days back on the water, until they found their swing again. But find it they did, and they promptly began to power past the other shells. On or off the water, they were almost always together now. They ate together, studied together, and played together. On weekend evenings, they gathered around the old upright piano in the parlor of the Varsity Boat Club and sang for hours. Don Hume tore through jazz tunes, show tunes, blues, and ragtime. Sometimes Roger Morris played saxophone and Johnny White played along on his violin, and almost always Joe got out his banjo or his guitar and joined in as well. Nobody laughed at him anymore. Nobody dreamed of laughing at him. By the end of May, the boys were again turning in phenomenal times on the water, but their success in Seattle didn't guarantee victory in Poughkeepsie. The regatta on the Hudson would be a 4-mile race, not 3, and the California boys had proven time and again that they were masters at the longer distance. On June 6, Ulrichsen took the varsity and JV out for one final 4-mile trial before leaving for Poughkeepsie. He told Bobby Mock to hold the varsity back behind leisurely stroke rate of 26. The varsity could not manage to stay behind. They kept edging out in front, simply on the power of their long, slow strokes. When Mock finally turned them loose in the final mile, they exploded into a 7-length lead, and they were still pulling away as they crossed the finish line. 4 days later, the boys arrived at Seattle's railroad station, led by a police escort with sirens wailing and red lights flashing. In the station, the marching band was already playing fight songs. The crowd was packed with cheerleaders, journalists, parents, cousins, next-door neighbors, and utter strangers. The boys had not just packed for New York. They had packed as if they had already made the Olympics and were heading for Berlin. Some of them were even making plans to tour Europe after the games, although none of them were sure where they'd get the money for that. Johnny White had a grand total of $14 in his pocket. Bobby Mock was hoping to visit his relatives in Switzerland and Alsace-Lorraine. At first, his father, Gaston, hesitated to give his son their addresses, but he agreed to send them later if the crew really went to Europe. The boys climbed aboard, and as the train coughed, lurched, and began to pull away, they hung from the window shouting farewells. "Goodbye, Mom. I'll write from Berlin." Joe hung out a window as well, searching. Then in a far corner he found her. Joyce was standing with his father and the kids, jumping up and down, holding a sign over her head. In the middle of the sign she had painted a large green 4-leaf clover. The Washington boys arrived in Poughkeepsie early in the morning on June 14th, in the midst of a summer thunderstorm. They were not using the rickety old shack for a boathouse this year. They moved into Cornell's former boathouse, right next to California's. The new quarters had been provided by the regatta authorities as a result of Washington's newfound respect in the East. It had hot showers, exercise facilities, electricity, and extra long beds, and the roof didn't leak. By the time they had finished settling in, they could smell food cooking, led by their noses, and by Joe Rance's nose in particular. They quickly discovered the best feature of the new place. There was a cookhouse on the beach, just 25 feet from their front door. An African-American woman named Avanda Mae Calamar was in charge, and she was an awe-inspiring cook. The boys had heaps of fried chicken for lunch, and they were in heaven. Nobody appreciated it more than Joe, who went back for seconds and then thirds. Seattle's Post-Intelligencer newspaper published a story on their first meal with a picture of Joe captioned, "Joe Rance, the eating champion." Pocock visited the California boathouse to check on the shell he'd built them, but the Washington boys declined to speak to their rivals. On the dock, they shared the 2 crews past each other silently, with eyes averted, like dogs circling before a fight. And although a fight on land was possible, a battle on the water was near certainty. During the next few days, word leaked out that Cal had turned in a blazing time of 1931 over 4 miles. After Washington held its own time trial, Ulrichsen announced that their time was slower, a fraction of a second over 1939. But Ulrichsen may have been trying to deceive Kai Ebright. Johnny White recorded the boys' true time in his journal that night, 1925. The next day, though, rumors began to circulate that California had held yet another time trial and turned in a phenomenal time of 1846. But Ulrichsen remained unruffled. He was not going to schedule another trial. He wanted well-rested boys in the race. He told his boys to relax. There would be only light workouts until race day, and that was fine with the boys. They already knew something that nobody else knew, not even their coach. Late on the night of their final time trial, after the wind had died down and the waters had calmed, they had begun to row back up the river, in the dark, side by side with the freshman and JV boats. It was a moonless night. The water was ink black. Bobby Mock set the boys to rowing at a leisurely 22 or 23. Joe and his crewmates chatted softly with the boys in the other two boats, but they soon found that they had pulled ahead without meaning to, just rowing soft and steady. Soon, in fact, they had pulled so far ahead that they could not even hear the boys talking in the other boats. And then, one by one, they realized they couldn't hear anything at all, except for the gentle murmur of their blades dipping into and out of the water. They were rowing in utter darkness now. They were alone together in a realm of silence and darkness. They were rowing perfectly, fluidly, mindlessly. They were rowing in perfect unity, as if on another plane, among the stars, just as Pocock had said, and it was beautiful. By the morning of the championship regatta, the consensus in the Eastern newspapers was that California and Cornell were the boats to beat in the varsity race. People crowded onto ferries, boats, and the observation train. As many as 90,000 fans lined both sides of the Hudson River. As the starting time approached, the breeze died. The water was placid, smooth, and glassy, tinged with bronze in the late afternoon light. The freshman came through again for Tom Bowles. He was wearing his lucky fedora, but he didn't need it. As his boys gradually overpowered Navy, then beat Cal by a boat length, an hour later Washington's JV crossed the line, 3 lengths ahead of Navy, still pulling away at the head of a long, strung-out parade of boats far to their rear. Even as the last boats crossed the line and the cheering began to die down, a murmur began to ripple through the crowd along the shore. Washington, for the second time in 2 years now, stood again on the brink of sweeping the regatta. California, on the other hand, could become only the second school ever to win the varsity race 4 years in a row. But anything was possible. Cornell looked as if they could finally win this year, or maybe Navy. As the observation train drew back upriver again for the start, the atmosphere grew electric. The crowd began to buzz. Boat whistles shrilled. Fans draped arms over one another's shoulders and sang college fight songs. On the train, in a car packed full of Washington coaches, alumni, and sports writers, George Pocock and Tom Bowles paced up and down the aisle. Al Ulbrichson sat alone in silence, looking out from under the brim of his white cloth cap toward the spot where Joe and the boys sat in their shell waiting. Washington had drawn the worst lane, number 7, far out in the middle of the river, where any hint of wind or current would be strongest. California had drawn the most protected lane, number 1. At 8 p.m., the starter called out, "Are you ready?" The starting gun popped, and for 5 full strokes, all 7 boats stayed even. Then Washington suddenly eased up. The other boats surged out in front of them. That was okay with Bobby Mock. That was just what he wanted. Prior to the race, Ulbrichson had explained that he had a new plan for his coxswain to follow. He wanted the boys to stay at a low, easy stroke rate, no matter what the other boats were doing. If they fell more than 2 boat lengths behind, he told Mock he should pick up the pace, but otherwise he wanted them to hold off until the halfway point, then start to raise the rate and pass the leaders at the end. Now, as Mock settled his crew in, rowing at a steady 28, he began to chant their newest rowing mantra in time with the stroke: "Save, save, save," reminding them to conserve their power. After half a mile, Washington was in last place, almost 5 lengths behind the leaders. A mile into the race, Navy and Penn were in the lead, with California and Columbia close behind. Washington passed Syracuse, but remained 4 lengths back. On the train, Al Ulbrichson was still silent and calm, slowly chewing a stick of gum. Soon, he figured, Bobby Mock would make his move, just as they'd planned. At 2 miles, Penn had begun to fade, falling behind Columbia. Cal and Navy were battling for the lead. Washington was in 5th place, but Bobby Mock still hadn't altered the beat at all. Ulbrichson began to grow uneasy. He had told Mock not to let the leaders get more than 2 lengths ahead. Now the boys were twice that far behind, and Mock was supposed to have started moving by now. But out on the water, Bobby Mock told Don Hume, "Take your time. We can catch those boys anytime we want." As they passed the 2.5-mile mark, Ulbrichson had begun to slump in his seat. He stopped chewing his gum. What on earth was Mock doing? Why in God's name didn't he turn them loose? Tom Bowles and George Pocock sat down looking morose. It was starting to look like a case of suicide. In the boat, Bobby Mock took a long look at the 4 lengths between his bow and California's stern and hollered to the boys facing him, "Okay, you lugs, we're 1 length behind." A roar went up as the crowds near the finish line began to see the leaders. Navy was neck and neck with Cal, and the 2 of them seemed to be running away with it. With a mile to go, Washington was still nearly 3 lengths back. The boys were rowing as if in a kind of trance now. There was little sound out in the middle of the river except for Mock's chanting. the rattle of oars and oarlocks, their own deep rhythmic breathing, and their pulses pounding in their ears. There was almost no pain. In the number 5 seat, Stub McMillan realized with astonishment that he was still breathing easy through his nose. On the train, Albertson muttered, "They're overplaying their hand. We'll be lucky to finish third." His face had gone white. Then, suddenly, Bobby Mock leaned into Don Hume's face and bellowed, "Give me 10 hard ones for Albertson." 8 long spruce oars bowed in the water 10 times. Then Mock bellowed again, "Give me 10 more for Pocock." Another 10 enormous strokes. Then another lie, "Here's California. We're on them. 10 more big ones for Mom and Dad." Very slowly, the Husky Clipper slipped past Columbia and began to creep up on Navy in second. On the train, someone called out, "Look at Washington! Look at Washington! Here comes Washington!" All eyes shifted from the leaders to the 8 white blades, barely visible out in the middle of the river. Another roar rose from the crowd. It seemed impossible for Washington to close the gap. They were a half-mile from the finish and still 2 lengths back. In the boat, Mock barked, "Okay, now, now, now!" Don Hume took the stroke up to 35, then to 36, then to 37. On the starboard side, Joe Rance fell in behind him just as smooth as silk. The boat began to swing. The bow began to rise out of the water. Washington slid past the Navy oarsmen as if their shell were pinned to the water. Cal's coxswain glanced over his shoulder. For the first time since he'd left it behind at the starting line, he saw the Washington boat sweeping up from behind him. He bellowed at his crew to pick it up. Mock hollered at Hume to take the Washington rate up another notch. The 2 boats careened into the last 500 yards, storming down the corridor of open water between the spectators' boats. With the finish line looming ahead, Bobby Mock screamed something nobody could understand. Johnny White in the number 4 seat suddenly had the sensation that they were flying. Shorty Hunt still hadn't seen the California boat fall into his field of view. He kept his eyes locked on the back of Joe Rance's neck and pulled with his whole heart. Joe had boiled everything down to one action, one continuous movement, one thought. The crew's old mantra was running through his mind like a river, not in his own voice, but in George Pocock's crisp English accent. M-I-B, M-I-B, M-I-B. On the train, Al Albertson stared silently at the scene unfolding in front of him. A Seattle sports writer began to holler, "Come on, Washington, come on!" Another writer shoved his paper press badge into his mouth and began to devour it. Tom Bowles was jumping up and down, beating the fellow in front of him with his lucky old fedora. Then, in the last 200 yards, Peyton suddenly came shrieking back into the boat, searing the boys' legs, their arms, their shoulders, tearing at their hearts and lungs as they desperately gulped at air. And in those last 200 yards, in an extraordinary burst of speed, Washington passed California. With each stroke, the boys took their rivals down by the length of another seat. By the time the 2 boats crossed the line, a glimmer of open water showed between the bow of Cal's boat and the stern of the Husky Clipper. Watching from the train, Albertson resumed chewing his gum. George Pocock threw back his head and howled. The sports writer removed the chewed-up remains of his press badge from his mouth. Tom Bowles continued beating the man in front of him with his lucky fedora, and in the boat the boys pumped their fists in the dark night air. When reporters approached Albertson, he stood up and said simply, "Well, they made it close, but they won." Then he added, "I guess that little runt knew what he was doing." Later, when they got back to the shell house, the boys found hundreds of excited fans waiting for them. They climbed out of the Husky Clipper, and following another rowing tradition, threw coxswain Bobby Mock into the Hudson to the delight of the spectators. After retrieving him from the water, they forced their way through the crowd into the building. Albertson climbed onto a bench. The boys, clutching jerseys they'd collected from the losing crews, sat on the floor around him. After a few remarks to all the rowers, proclaiming that every son and daughter of Washington was proud of them, he addressed the varsity. Never in history has a crew given a more gallant game fight to win the most coveted rowing honor at stake in this country than the varsity did today, and I can only say to you that I am proud and happy." He paused and looked around the room and then concluded, "I never expect to see a better road race." Then he stepped down. Nobody cheered, nobody stood up and applauded. Everyone just sat, silently soaking in the moment. On the stormy night in January 1935, when Albertson had first started talking openly about going to the Olympics, everyone had stood and cheered. But then it had seemed like a dream. Now they were on the verge of actually making it happen. Chapter 22. Here's where we take California. On July 1st, after a week of working out and relaxing in Poughkeepsie, the boys packed up their possessions, loaded the Husky Clipper onto a baggage car, and headed for the 1936 U.S. Olympic trials. By 6 that evening, they had arrived at Princeton and entered the world of the Ivy League, the nation's oldest and most prestigious colleges. This was a world of status and tradition and wealth. It was unlike anything the boys had ever known. The young men who attended these schools weren't loggers and fishermen and farmers. They were the sons of bankers and lawyers and senators. The boys from Washington moved into the stately Princeton Inn. From their rooms, they watched Princeton graduates stroll around the neighboring golf course wearing knickerbockers, high argyle socks, and tweed caps. The boys stopped by the Princeton Boathouse, a large and elegant stone structure, and explored Lake Carnegie. Originally, Princeton crews had rowed in a nearby canal, but the boat traffic proved troublesome, so Princeton asked the wealthy steel tycoon Andrew Carnegie to build them a lake just for their crew. The result, Lake Carnegie, was shallow, straight, and protected. It was first-class rowing water. 6 crews were competing for the right to go to Berlin: Washington, California, the Pennsylvania Athletic Club, Navy, Princeton, and the New York Athletic Club. The field would be divided into 2 groups of 3 for the elimination heats on July 4th. The 2 top boats in each heat would advance to a final contest of 4 boats the next day. The boys from Washington were not so worried about the preliminaries. They would race against Princeton and the winged footers of the New York Athletic Club. Neither was a real contender. They were concerned about the finals, though. The 2,000-meter race was less than a third the length of the 4-mile Poughkeepsie competition. They weren't certain they could beat Cal at such a short distance. The start would be critical, and they'd been having trouble with their starts lately. On Saturday, the 4th of July, the boys left for their preliminary race, a little before 6:30. It was a buggy, sultry evening. Several thousand people had gathered along the shores of the lake for the qualifying heats. A floating platform with starting stalls had been specifically built for the trials. The boys backed the Husky Clipper into their stall and waited. At the gun, Washington began to charge out in front almost immediately. Soon Mock told Don Hume to drop the rate. In the 3rd minute of the race, Hume dropped it further. Even as he dropped the rate, the boat began to widen its lead. By the halfway mark, Washington had open water on both boats. As they began to approach the finish line, the winged footers made a move, sprinting past Princeton and challenging Washington. Mock told Hume to ease the stroke rate back up. The boys from Washington pulled briskly ahead and sliced across the finish line with a 2.5-length lead. The boys were surprised at how easily they had won. Even in the muggy evening air, they'd hardly broken a sweat. Now it was time to watch the competition. They paddled out of the racing lines and took up a position along the bank at about the 1,500-meter mark. The boys wanted to see for themselves how the California crew would fare. The race was tight, but in the final 500 meters, California executed a tremendous surge, suddenly blowing past both Navy and Penn. They won by a quarter of a boat length, and they had completed the course a full 10 seconds faster than Washington had. Cal obviously was exceptional when it came to rowing 2,000-meter sprint races. That night, the boys were filled with anxiety. Albertson went from room to room, sitting on the ends of bunks, reassuring his boys. He tried to remind them that they had, in effect, won a sprint in the last 2,000 meters at Poughkeepsie. He was telling them what they already knew in their hearts, but needed to hear one more time. They could beat any crew in America, including California, at any distance. All they had to do, he told them, was to continue to believe in one another. Thunderstorms rumbled over New Jersey the next morning. Rain pounded the roof of the Princeton Inn. By noon, though, the day had grown hot and muggy, but clear. Lake Carnegie lay mirror-smooth, reflecting a translucent blue sky. The final race to determine which crew would represent the United States in Berlin was not scheduled to begin until 5 p.m., so the boys spent most of the day inside trying to stay cool. Late in the afternoon, the crowds began arriving, about 10,000 people braving the heat to witness just 6 minutes of racing. Back in the state of Washington, people in smoky little mill towns, on soggy dairy farms, in fancy Seattle mansions, and in the Huskies' drafty shell house on Lake Washington, gathered around their radios, anxious to see if their boys would be going to Berlin. At 4:45, the crews from California, Pennsylvania, Washington, and the New York Athletic Club paddled out onto Lake Carnegie. As Washington tried to back into its stall, a large white swan blocked the way. Bobby Mock, yelling and waving his arms furiously, finally persuaded it to move slowly aside. Washington settled into position, then California backed in. The Washington boys were bare-chested, having stripped off their jerseys just before climbing into their boat. They sat now with their oars in the water, ready for the first hard pull. Each boy stared ahead at the neck of the oarsman in front of him, trying to breathe slow and easy, settling his heart and mind into the boat. Tom Bowles had given Bobby Mock his lucky fedora. Now the coxswain reached under his seat and touched the old hat. A little after 5, the starting gun flashed. Washington got off to a poor start. The other 3 boats surged ahead. The New York Athletic Club went briefly to the head of the pack, but the Pennsylvania Athletic Club quickly snatched the lead back. California settled into third place, 10 feet in front of Washington's bow. After rowing hard to regain momentum, but still dead last, Bobby Mock and Don Hume slowly dropped the boat's stroke rate. Yet the Husky Clipper held its position just behind California's stern. A quarter of the way down the course, Bobby Mock found himself creeping up on California. He told Hume to drop the rate again. As they approached the halfway mark, the New York Athletic Club suddenly began to fade and quickly fell behind Washington. The Pennsylvania Athletic Club was in the lead. The Husky Clipper remained stuck on California's tail. The boys continued to row at the same rate. Don Hume and Joe Rance were setting the pace with long, slow, sweet, fluid strokes, and the boys on each side were falling in behind them flawlessly. The boat became a single thing, gracefully and powerfully coiling and uncoiling itself, propelling itself forward. Each time the blades entered the lake, they disappeared almost without a splash or ripple. Just before the 1,500-meter mark, Bobby Mock leaned into Don Hume and shouted, "Here's California! Here's where we take California!" Hume knocked the stroke rate up just a bit, and Washington swiftly walked past Cal, seat by seat. They began to creep up on Pennsylvania Athletic Club, then pulled even with them. But Bobby Mock still hadn't really turned the boys loose. At last, coming inside 500 meters, he barked at Hume. For 5 or 6 strokes, the bows of the two boats moved back and forth like the heads of racehorses coming down the stretch. Finally, Washington's bow swung decisively out in front by a few feet. From there on, Washington simply blew past the exhausted rowers from the Pennsylvania Athletic Club, swinging into the last few hundred meters with extraordinary grace and power. At the finish line, they were a full length ahead and still widening the lead. As they crossed the line, Bobby Mock stood bolt upright in the stern of the shell, triumphantly thrusting one fist into the air. All over the state of Washington, people stood and cheered. What had been a dream was now a reality. The boys from Washington were going to the Olympics. For the first time ever, Seattle was going to compete in an athletic event on the world stage. Sitting by the radio at Harry's new home on Lake Washington, Joyce and the kids cheered too. Harry said nothing but pulled out a large American flag, tacked it on the wall above the radio, and stood back to admire it. The kids ran off to tell their friends. Joyce herself was quietly jubilant. The victory meant she would not see Joe again for months, but it would be worth the wait. Flashing broad white grins, Joe and his crewmates paddled back to the Princeton shell house, tossed Bobby Mock in the water, fished him out, and then lined it up for the photographers. Ulrichsen said a few words, but they did not really capture the moment. Finally, he had in his grasp what had eluded him for years. Everything had come together. He had the right oarsmen with the right attitudes, the right personalities, the right skills. Thanks to George Pocock, he had a perfect boat, sleek, balanced, and wickedly fast. He had a winning strategy and a coxswain with the guts and smarts to make hard decisions and make them fast. It all added up to something far beyond the sum of its parts. But there was a problem. That night, the chairman of the U.S. Olympic Rowing Committee, Henry Penn Burke, informed Al Ulrichsen, George Pocock, and Ray Ekman, the athletic director at Washington, that if the boys wanted to go to Berlin, they would have to pay their own way. Ulrichsen was stunned and livid. No one had hinted that the winning crew would have to fund its own trip. The university had barely been able to pay to send the boys east to Poughkeepsie and Princeton, and the boys themselves, working-class Americans, certainly didn't have the dough. Burke, who was also the chairman of the Pennsylvania Athletic Club, noted that the Pennsylvania Athletic Club had the necessary funds if Washington couldn't come up with $5,000 by the end of the week. Burke said the crew from Pennsylvania would take its place in Berlin. As far as Ulrichsen was concerned, the whole thing stank. Late that night, Ulrichsen, Pocock, Ekman, and the Washington sports writers began making phone calls back to Seattle. The next morning, Seattleites awoke to alarming headlines and radio news bulletins, warning that their boys might not be able to afford the trip to Berlin. The entire town went to work. Students flooded the streets of downtown Seattle selling paper badges for 50 cents apiece. Money and pledges began to pour in from newspapers, companies, anonymous donors, Washington alumni, and the boys' hometowns, everywhere from Joe Squim to Bobby Mock's Montesano. In 2 days, they raised $5,000. The boys from Washington were officially the United States 8-oared Olympic rowing team and good to go to Berlin.